is a really, really important topic in how the Republic pretty much collapses. So if you understand this, you're pretty much understanding half of what you need to understand for the test. So with the effects of the wars of expansion, Rome expanded massively, very quickly. Now they had a governmental system that was designed to control one major city and then a bunch of different confederate cities. Okay, that was what their governmental system was designed for, all right? Now, when they decided to expand massively outside of Italy and take all of this new territory, then essentially what they were doing was making the Roman Empire too large for the system of government that controlled it. So the Republic began to face a whole lot of small issues that added together to make the Republic really, really weak. Okay, so from the 2nd century BC onwards, the Republic is pretty much going rapidly downhill because of the issues caused by these wars. So you can see that at the end of the Punic Wars, they control all of Spain. Okay, they're heading down into Macedonia. Okay, and they also control where Carthage was on the tip of North Africa. All right, so they have taken a lot more territory. Now, the problems that this caused, really, really simplified. The social fabric of Rome is undergoing massive change. Now, there's lots of reasons for that, and we're going to look at them individually. Secondly, there was severe economic dislocation. So, the gap between rich and poor grew rapidly, and it grew massively. All right? And it was because of all of the money that was flowing in that had been taken during these wars. So you have new wealth in the hands of a very small minority, obviously patricians, and then also another group, which will become very important soon. And foreign cultural influences were introduced, which simply starts to erode Roman morality. So remember, Roman men are all raised in a particular way. When they start bringing in thousands of slaves, hundreds of thousands of slaves, from areas where they have conquered in war, you are diluting Roman culture. You are bringing in all of these people who aren't Roman and don't give a damn about Rome. And they have a really severe impact on the culture and social fabric of Rome. Okay, so this is what Florus, okay, a Roman historian, has to say about it. So he says that the first 100 years of this period were pure and righteous, a golden age, free from greed and crime, while the innocence of the old pastoral life was untouched by corruption. The next 100 years were unhappy and deplorable because of the internal calamities. The resources and wealth gained in our conquests spoiled the morals of the age and ruined the state, which was engulfed in its own vices as in a common sewer. So he's basically saying that early republic, golden age of Rome. It's beautiful, it's amazing, there's no corruption, there's no greed and crime, everybody's innocent and happy. It's a total load of crap, but that's what he believes. Now, remember, he is writing long time after the early republic, and the reason that he has these views is because these writers would look back to the days of the early republic and they would go, that was the glorious days of Rome. Before we were ruled by emperors, before we were ruled by despots, when we controlled ourselves. But of course they didn't live through it, so they didn't really know how corrupt it was. Okay, now all of these issues that we're going to go through, they set the stage for Rome to transform from a republic to an empire, all right? And that's what you need to be able to understand. First massive issue. This is the biggest one. This is the most important one. Slavery. So every time Rome would conquer an area of land, they would deal with the people in two ways. They would either bring them into a Roman confederacy in some way. So they might be what were known as the allies socii, the Italian allies, okay? Or they would enslave the population. Now, in many cases, they would allow men sometimes to have limited citizenship and join the army. And then other, less able men, women, children, things like that would be sold into slavery, okay? One of the biggest problems for Rome at the end of the 2nd century was how much slave labor was actually being used in Italy. Okay, that was a big problem. Okay, so thousands of slaves, hundreds of thousands, taken from all of Rome's provinces, converging on Italy and doing all of the work. So that's going to cause a really serious issue. So slavery is the big one. Now, the next one's not an issue, but it's something you need to understand. It is known as the Ager Publicus. Now, every single time Rome would conquer a new area of land, all of that land would become the land of the Roman Republic. It became the Ager Publicus, public land. Now, this essentially meant if land was classified as Ager Publicus, it could be used by anyone. So it was kind of like in the feudal system, the common land that could be used by the peasants. So this was not really an ownership thing. It was more of a, this land's not being used, why don't you guys farm it and do something with it? So the Ager Publicus was a really, really good way for Rome to get their farmers onto land. Okay, now the Senate controlled the distribution of this Ager Publicus. But all it was, you would pay a nominal fee, pretty much a one-time, very small rent fee to the Senate, and they would say, yep, you can farm that land. You didn't own it, but you could farm it. We actually have something very similar in Australia. Does anybody know what it's called? So some of our massive cattle properties fall under this category of land ownership. No?
Well, it's when they're owned by big corporations, but...
No, not corporations. Some of them have been sold recently, like Kirby Station and stuff, but we've got what's called freehold land and crown land in Australia, and I'm no lawyer and I don't understand it fully, but crown land is land that is still controlled in some way by the crown, so by the government, but it is leased very cheaply for like large farms and stuff like that. But technically speaking, the farmer doesn't own it. That's kind of like the Ager Publicus, okay? It's leased cheaply to farmers, but they don't own the land, okay? So that's a really good thing, the fact that these guys can access that. But as a direct result of the wars of expansion, these tracts of land, the Ager Publicus, began to be controlled by the wealthy. Now, the way they did that was pretty simple, but also really, really ingenious. Who are the people who are controlling, or who are the people who are voting in the assemblies? No, in the assemblies. Who are voting in the assemblies? The common people, the plebs. Who makes up the bulk of the army? The plebs. So, during all of these wars, where are most of the plebs going to be? Dead, or fighting. So you had pretty much half of the male population of Rome of voting age over fighting foreign wars, which meant if the Senate wanted to say, we're going to take control of the Ager Publicus, there was no one to vote against it. And so they didn't do it illegally, they just pretty much took control. Now, senators were not allowed to engage in trade, but they could purchase the land and they could get other people to do it for them. So what happened is the Ager Publicus began to be combined into massively large estates. And these estates used slave labour to grow crops. This is going to be a very significant problem, okay? The large estates were called latifundia. And that's a really, really important word. So Ager Publicus is public land. Latifundia is a big estate that is controlled by a wealthy person, and they have taken a whole bunch of different areas of land and turned them into like a giant plantation, all right? Now, they weren't taking this land illegally. They were just doing it a little bit dodgily, but they weren't breaking the law, okay? So Roman senators would set up freedmen, okay, so just people who weren't senators, who had their freedom, to pretty much control this land for them, and then they would get all of the profits. So it's corrupt as all hell. So the expansion of these latifundia, it drove the poor off the land, and it consolidated the land in the hands of the wealthy, while that land was being totally and utterly worked by slaves. Really, really big issue. All right? So, I won't go through that because I've just pretty much explained it. Okay, so the biggest issue here is as all of these small farms are bought up by the wealthy, so as all of the Ager Publicus is controlled by the wealthy, you have a whole lot of peasant farmers who now have no land. Now, many of them didn't even have land when they... So, a lot of these farmers, they would be told, drop your farming implements, we're going to war with Carthage. And they would be conscripted into army service because they were Roman citizens. Now, as they were conscripted, they'd be like, okay, we're going off to fight for Rome. This is why I am a Roman. This is what it means to be Roman. But then when they got back, half of them didn't have their land anymore. It had simply been taken and placed into these latifundia. So you can understand why these guys would be pretty pissed off, all right? Now that led to a whole bunch of very angry, very, very annoyed people with no jobs. Okay, and it all comes back to they took their jobs. Took their jobs! Now, guys, essentially, you can see something like the same basic thing happened in Greece. It's the same concept. Slavery, taking the jobs of common farmers, and then you have an urban mob that is drifting into Rome. Now that urban mob, they have no skills apart from farming. There is massive unemployment in Rome simply because all of these guys are trying to get a job and they can't, and they became known as the urban mob. Now this urban mob, from this point onwards, they pretty much control Roman politics. Because if you piss off the mob, you're not going to last very long. Okay? And so Roman politics changed dramatically because of these guys. All right? Now, another big problem. The provincial governments of Rome. Rome had started as nothing more than a city on the banks of the Tiber. Now, they controlled all of these different provinces. So by 133 BC, which is when everything goes to hell, they controlled all of that land. Now, each one of those provinces is ruled by a different governor. The people who are generally ruling these, they used to be praetors, but these days they are proconsuls and propraetors. So these are people in incredible positions of power outside of the cursus honorum who have been granted a governorship. If you were one of these people, what are you going to do with that governorship? Think about it. You are going to abuse the living hell out of it because you are a long way from Rome, you're rich, you're quite possibly a bastard, and you're going to treat those people terribly. And that's what many of these governors did. They taxed the hell out of them, okay, because they could. And so you had massive corruption in the provincial system. Really, really big problem, okay? Now, I'll skip over that stuff because that's basically the same thing. Now, during this time, you had the emergence of a new social class in Rome, known as the equites, or the equites, depending on how you pronounce it. Now, these guys were a social class that developed during the 2nd century BC. Now, essentially it means horsemen. So these were men who could serve as cavalry in the Roman military. That's what it started as anyway, but it became its own social class based on wealth and rank. Firstly, they are not senators. They are not patricians. These guys, think of them as the middle class of Rome. They're above plebeians, but they are below the senatorial patrician class. Now, these guys amassed great wealth because they were able to participate in business. Senators, on the other hand, could have no commercial enterprise while they were serving as a senator. So being a senator was not a good way to get rich. They still did through corruption, but these guys could control everything commercially, and they did, and they became incredibly wealthy because of it. One of the ways that they became incredibly wealthy is that they would control the collection of taxes in all of the Roman provinces. Now, the way this system would work, the Roman Senate would say, we need taxes collected in Hispania. The Senate has decreed that a contract will be put out, and whoever can provide the cheapest price for that contract to collect all of those taxes, you get the contract. It's just like what our government does now. Okay, so they'll say, we need to build this new tunnel. Here is a contract tender. Whoever can give us the cheapest price, you will build that tunnel. Now, what this meant is that all of these equites were undercutting each other as much as they could to provide the cheapest price, which meant they then need to recoup their costs by being corrupt and taxing people more than they should. Okay? Now, because you now had a dual elite in Rome, you had the patricians and you had the equites. The equites began to campaign for more power in politics. They wanted to be able to be elected as senators. Okay, so they have been kept out of political office because they're not senatorial class, so therefore they don't have the right to be part of the Senate. But they want that to change. That becomes massively important. All right, it actually leads to what is called the social war. All right, and we'll be looking at that soon. Now, over this time, the Senate had become completely and totally dominant while these wars were being fought. Now, I'm going to just put up a little flowchart, which would be worth jotting down in just points 1, 2, 3, 4. Just put it in a list, all right? So the first thing that happened, the Senate began as only an advisory body. So remember, they're passing, senators consult them, the advice of the Senate. It's supposed to be followed, but legally it doesn't have to be. However, by the 2nd century, it had total control. It was the absolute true governing power of Rome. Now the reasons for that, and this is the important stuff. The Second Punic War assisted in the rise of the Senate because so many plebs were away fighting these wars, which meant you had few men of voting age in the assemblies, which meant ex-magistrates and senators and stuff like that, they were the ones that people listened to because they had experience. They had dignitas and auctoritas. They were upholding mos maiorum. So people just simply went, these guys are doing the right thing. There's no problem. These guys are leading us well. Okay, now, when the problems did begin to rear their head, it was too late. The Senate had taken control, the rich had taken the land, and the poor had been completely screwed over. So all of this is leading up to this crisis. So this precedent had been set where the Senate could completely and totally influence all politics in Rome. That was not supposed to be the way it was. The assembly was supposed to have the dominant power, even if it was only a yes-no vote. But the assemblies have been weakened greatly by these wars of expansion. All right? And that leads to the crisis of 133 BC. Okay? And that's pretty much everything laid out in a flowchart. Now, we're going to go through all of this stuff in further detail. So if there's anything in there you were just like, what the hell? Don't worry, we're going to be doing lots of stuff on this. But essentially, this is the first. So most historians believe that this crisis, this is the beginning of the end for the Republic. This is where it begins to slide downhill. And then by the time Julius Caesar comes to power, the Republic is completely and totally dead. Okay? And it takes from 133 BC up until just before the 1st century AD. So we're talking pretty much 100 odd years and the Republic's gone. Okay, so a lot of historians believe that it wasn't that strong to begin with, because once these problems reared their head, they couldn't deal with them. And Rome, Western Rome, as a republic, simply ceased to exist, and it became an empire under control of one man. Okay, and that one man had complete and total imperium.